like Eugene Rosenstock Hussey, he predicted this coming out of World War II. He said within a couple of generations, America would be returned to some sort of tribal identity. Americans would be returned to tribal identities because he said Christendom was broken by the world wars. That and so the effect is going to take a while, but because the habits of taking our identity in something, large that's bigger than what can be sort of phenomenologically noticed, bigger than the sorts of things we look at and say, oh, we dress the same, or we have the similar linguistic, we have the same accent, those sorts of things are normally what people say. Well, when you say, oh, who are you, where are you from, you say people, it's the people that look and sound and eat like them, really, that you used to choose. Well, Christendom gave us a larger framework. So where are you from? You say, well, Christendom, I'm from the West, I'm European. There's a big identity that the church gives that's over everything. When the church is over everything, or sort of has this other plane, the spiritual identity that's greater and bigger, and everything else fits underneath, then you can have those sorts of large identities. Nationalism was a way of trying to keep a larger identity without Jesus, and so guys like Eugene Rosenstock Hussey, they saw nationalism in competition with Christendom, as though it was the road out of Christendom. But he said it's not going to last, because without Jesus holding it together, that's a temporary, the nation as an identity for individuals is a temporary thing. And so he said, so you're going to see the tribalization of identity. And he's right. It's been slowly happening, but the longer you go on, and now we have people profiting off of the tribalization, and so they're encouraging it, and they're profiting off of the rivalry between races. They're profiting off of the rivalry between accents, and so they're encouraging it. But the reason that works at all is because the large identities that we grasped onto have all failed us, because they were all created things that we were trying to draw an identity from, which is something that only God is supposed to do, right? So it's an idolatry to try and draw our identity on anything other than our creator. So our ultimate identity, there's all sorts of sub identities that can fit within an ultimate identity, but when we try and draw our ultimate identity from something created, then we get tribalism.
Do you think then we had nationalism, American nationalism, that kind of kicked in after the First World War?
Yeah. Oh man, Eugene Rosenstock Hussey called it the Star Spangled Crusade. He
Wow.
said so American nationalism, he was when because the world wars meant there was no more Christendom, right? Christendom was broken. The back of Christendom was broken, and so he said, here we come now with American nationalism, which is an attempt to say, yeah, I get that the rest of the West is gone, but we're still here, and we can hold our own. We'll hold ourselves up without the rest of the West that we used to depend on, right? Up until the 30s, we were still, even the Presbyterian Church was still sending a lot of people to Europe to get a theological education, right? Because that
was kind of the problem too, though, wasn't we were sending people even to Germany, which was
yep.
Right. Those German theologians screwed us up,
right? But we didn't know, because it was we were existing on in the habits of Christendom, and we didn't realize that Christendom had been rotting over there.
Mm.
The we There were some people that were starting to sound the alarm, but and Machen, when he comes back, so Bonhoeffer's starts trying to sound the alarm. Machen starts trying to sound the alarm.
Mm.
And what's interesting is we think of Bonhoeffer as sort of an evangelical, um, because he was a believer, right? In comparison to evangelicals, though, he was much more of a modern in the way he thought about knowledge and the way he thought about a lot of things. But he really knew the Lord, and when he came and visited America and spent some time amongst the evangelicals here, spent some time amongst the black church here, and he came back to Germany, and he said, we don't realize how far we've slid, how far we've
Yeah.
fallen, because it happened slowly over generations. And so um he did, but then because he goes straight into the conflict of World War II, he doesn't have time to basically work through all of the um
The
theological
theological, yeah.
implications and everything. So he just says we've got to stand firm, knowing that if the church doesn't stand firm now, then there won't be a church in the next generation. Because Hitler, in his plans to rebuild Germany, there were literally no churches. I mean,
You
there
know,
were no
I just
buildings reserved for church in the rebuilt Germany that Hitler had planned.
no, that was the church. Germany was the new,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
I think I don't know if we've talked about it, but one of the things that gets overlooked, and this is one of the things I try and remember for Black History Month with my kids, is remind them that a lot of times there is, and it's not all the time, but there is this way of telling stories of kind of, and not just conservatives do this, but liberals do this too, of kind of like white saviorism inside of the Black community. And what I mean by that is, so you have a lot of when the social justice movement starts um, with their nonsense, they don't know what they're doing. They're putting up a form of white objectivity, and they're saying, here's the standard, white people have made it, and unless we've reached to that standard, then we're not really human, right? And so
right,
you'll
right.
find almost in all of their storytelling, like that's, and which is at the end of the day is minimizing the humanity of Black people, and they're doing it trying to find this form of equality. And so when they tell stories, they mess it all up, right? And then you have the same kind of thing that's happened in history where every time a Black community is saved, it's always white people, right? And you have these two things, and social justice movement have become exactly like what it is they say they hate.
Right, right.
And you know what I mean? And so they tell the same stories, and I'm sitting here looking like y'all are telling the same stories. But I try to remind my kids, like, the way that the gospel works is that when the gospel is saturated into any particular group, you will always find the gospel making connections with other groups who are in relationship with in covenant, right? Bonhoeffer is a great example of that. So you have people in America, Black people in America, who in that time are still coming out of, they're basically almost one generation removed from slavery at that point,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And so you have Bonhoeffer coming over to New York and seeing these people who are building their own churches, building their own towns, doing their own business in the midst of oppression, real oppression, not this fake stuff we be talking about now. Real oppression where you can't go into stores because of the color of your skin,
Right.
where you can't buy products, right? And he sees that and he's like, whoa. And he sees the church services that happen. He's taken back by so he's teaching Sunday school in these Black churches, right? It's
Right.
Bonhoeffer. And he's having a strong relationship with these people. And he takes and records their singing, their music back over to Germany. And he's like, guys, we can do this. And the influence of the Black church that was anchored in the scriptures then had a massive influence on Bonhoeffer and their resistance in Germany. And
Yeah,
that's not something that gets talked about.
the singing of the gospel songs
Yep.
that was how they united to fight Hitler.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah,
and
that was right.
that was how they stayed encouraged while in Hitler's prisons, is they would
Yep.
sing those gospel, American gospel tunes together.
And I think a lot of people want to make the connection, want to point out black and white, and I want to point out the gospel from human to
Hmm.
human. Like that was
Right.
the thing that was a connecting, and it didn't matter. He saw that these people were having this kind of battle because of the color of their skin, and they had the same sort of battles, right? Regardless of all Germans, and yet they're still having the same battle that they're having over here. And he's like, wow,
Yeah.
they're successful by being independent, right? And he's seeing that whole reality and then takes
So,
that and
yeah,
uses that.
and it's successful by it's not even just the independence. It's the successful by saying, well, we don't need your permission to be human. You're
That's
not
right. Yeah.
yeah, you're not the one that gives us our definition as humans. They're
You're not our
they're
savior,
I
right?
yeah, they're not our savior. Their identity is independent of the well, it's even independent of their circumstances, right? Their
That's
identity
right. That's what he
is
saw.
rooted in Christ. And so when he and I mean, it's there were there were a lot of people in America that thought Hitler was on the right track right at the
Yeah.
time.
Oh
Right.
yeah.
So yeah,
Oh yeah.
he was Times Man of the Year. Um and and so especially the folks on the left were really excited about everything he was doing. So the
Kind of everybody was though. I think it
everybody
was.
was, yeah, but because you think of like the doctor that ran that set up the um set up Germany's gas chambers was he wrote in the first Planned Parenthood magazine, right? He so that they were putting Hitler's doctor, in explaining how why it's so important to keep the races pure, and that Planned Parenthood was the one that was publishing his stuff here in America. Right? So um because she because Margaret Sanger wanted to weed the human race of all the brown skinned people. So um you have the same sort of ideology growing over here. Uh we just it our conflict just we wasn't for the the same sort of blood and soil. um we didn't have the same claim on soil that the Germans did of thousands of years here and that sort of thing, but we had the same ideology. And it really was an era of that ideology became I mean, I think as we go forward in history, they'll look back on that era, that era of the 19th century and the early 20th century, as the era of the rule of ideologies. It was a fight which is the idea that's going to define everything else. And
When you I just when
go
you
ahead,
talk about
go ahead.
ideology, would you define ideology? So when you say like it's the fight of ideology, because I've been thinking through this, and the thing that's bothering me so much, and I think I have this right, so I want to check it, is the Christian ideological or ideology, um, that or conservative ideology that I see right now. And when I think of ideology, I think of a certain form of a perfected idea that has no reality to get implemented in the current situation, right? When I think of ideology
Yeah, I mean,
or
ideology
ideologicalism or ideologues, you know?
is it, yeah, exactly. It's when you take a particular idea and make it the ground that everything else is judged by, right? So um when if some so this is where, like, you know, I think capitalism is a good thing, for example. But when somebody accuses me of being a capitalist, what they're saying is that the idea of capitalism, or the exchange of capital or the control of capital or something like that, everything else is defined according to that, right? Because there's an ideology of
Uh,
capitalism that I would say, well, no, that's a bad thing. The ideology of capitalism says all is capitalism. Everything is capital. And it's the same with um, Marx's one idea is that everything is economic. Everything is the true value of everything is economic. So mankind is an economic animal, and that's what gives him his definition. And that's why you have to control. If you control the economy, you control mankind, or you have to control. And it ends up working out the other way. You have to control everything about mankind to control the economy. And so that's why you get such oppressive regimes. But it's because an ideology is what makes it make sense to people, to say, when people say, well, yeah, the USSR was on to something. I mean, I know they killed a lot of people, but they were onto something with this or with that, and you think, how can you just say, well, I know they killed millions, but well, an ideology is what it takes to justify that sort of sin. So when you have a particular idea that everything else is judged according to, then or everything else is centered in, then you have an ideology, right? So Christianity is not an ideology, right? Because we have the triune God at the center of all things, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So it's not an idea at the center of everything that we
It's
do.
a person.
It's a person. It's one God revealed in three persons, and who exists in three persons, and he is the defining point of all things revealed in Jesus Christ. So instead of an impersonal idea, you have a personal God. So that's why, um, we can say, well, God is unhappy with that thing. You can't say, well, capitalism is unhappy with that thing. Capitalism is,
I see.
so
Inanimate object.
so
Yeah, inanimate.
yeah. But when you say, well, capitalism will put this right, which people will say, right? Give it time.
Yeah.
Capitalism will put it right. You're dealing in ideology at that point, right?
But
You're not.
so is that not a reality? But what one is trying to say is that if you give capitalism enough time, the way that people operate inside of that structure, it has a way of fixing itself.
Um, so it does if God is
I
also
see what you're saying.
keeping things consistent and holding
You're
us
saying,
back from ultimate sin. And because you look at something like when the first missionaries in the modern era got to India, because there were missionaries back in the first century in India, but when the missionary movement of the 18th 19th century, when it reached India, um, India was on an incredibly self-destructive path. Um, and the two kind of signs, or there were really three kind of points where India was in the middle of destroying itself. You had these traveling gods that were traveling around the country and that were requiring suicide, right? These suicide gods, and people would run out there, they would get themselves all ramped up, and then they would go kill themselves as the god came past the village. So you had these suicide gods. Then you had the god of that central river, was requiring more and more child sacrifice. So you had more and more children being thrown into the river. And then you had the practice of when a man died, the women, his wife was required to burn herself up, right? So you had these three central practices in which, if they had continued, it would have been the destruction of the Indian people, right? And the Christian missionaries said, okay, it's going to take a while to get these folks all converted, but we should stop these suicidal practices. And so they worked to get these suicidal practices made illegal, because there there isn't an invisible hand of capitalism that, if you just let it go, will stop the self-destructive nature of mankind, of humanity. When it get when a culture decides to commit suicide, capitalism can't stop it, right? And so there's a suicidal tendency within the human heart, that can get a grip on a culture, and it
Can
the
can I
and
add
so
to that? Go ahead.
yeah, so capitalism can't save us from those sorts of things, right? So
Is it the same way that, it's funny because I think we look, maybe I'm saying this wrong, but maybe we look at the Constitution even like an ideology, because
mhm,
we think that it stands in and of itself by itself. It's sovereign. We treat it as a
right,
sovereign. Is that the same way?
right,
And so that we think that the Constitution will fix it. But the truth is, and even the authors of the Constitution said, unless then we have people who are moral, godly people, there is
right,
no help for you in this Constitution. And so there's a presupposition in this that says we must first have God, who is author and finisher of all things, operating towards our good because of faithful covenant keepers. And then the operation of capitalism or constitutions can then be worth something because God
right,
is blessing it, right? Where we don't
yeah,
think like that. We think if we can put into place it's legalism. We
yeah,
think that
yeah,
if we put into place like things in our homes and not to say that you don't have to have those things, you do, but we think the things that in and of themselves, oh man, I'm seeing all this. This is like sacraments and symbolism and means
yep,
of grace and all of it. This is all connected
yeah,
because
and it's the difference between a mechanistic cosmology and a personal cosmology, in which the Holy Spirit is present everywhere, active everywhere, and holding all things together, by the word of His power. That Christ is the actual integration point of all things personally. And all of the ideological movements depend upon a mechanistic understanding
they're void of God.
of the cosmos. And
So,
so
but
it's, as Christians, it's easy to pick, the more conservative one, or pick the one that looks right, or and never and not and then fall into an ideology, um the assumptions of an ideology, right? I mean, even if we're not ideologues,
right.
to fall into the assumptions of an ideology, or because we share a lot of the same cosmological assumptions. And so we think we live in a mechanistic world. And so when we um when we we look for mechanistic solutions.
Right. So then we'll come in and we'll say something like, you know what you need? You need capitalism. You put
Right,
capitalism in it and it'll work. And then, but then we have, this is the thing, we kind of have this either or, and this is where I think the poetry comes in instead of both and, right?
right.
So you got some people who will come and say, well, you just need Jesus. And it's like, you just need Jesus, you got Jesus. But then they don't have an outworking of what Jesus does in a society.
Right.
And they can't lay out like, this is what the gospel does in culture, in your business plannings, in your business dealings, in your covenants
Yeah.
with each other, and so they forget that actually it's really a forgetting of the second table of the law.
Yeah.
They bring the first table, and then you're like, well, but then the love for neighbor doesn't exist. What does that look
Right.
like worked out?
Well, it's like, this is one of the things that's been fun working at Lore, because we have these corporate meetings where you've got all of the officers of the corporation together, and we're making decisions, and somebody will quote a proverb, and another person will say, well, but Jesus in this parable says this, and like, we're working out our business plans
Mm,
with open Bibles, right? And with current studies, and with discussions about what's the history of other corporations that are in our same field. Like Marcus and I are both constant readers of the history of television because we're working in television distribution. And so reading the history of television. Well, the reason you can do that, though, theologically, is because God is present and consistent, right? So you can look at the history of, say, HBO and say, what's the wisdom to learn with the way God consistently works in the world? How has HBO? So it's not. So there's a mechanistic way to approach history that says here's the way that these things work, and we need to implement excuse me, implement from so this sort of thing because we've seen it happen this way in the past, right? And this is the way this machine works. And but it's not like you say, well, it's all about Jesus, so we don't study history. Right. We study history and we say, okay, what kind of world has God set up? What kind of world is God guiding? And what's the nature of this place? How do we live well and live wisely in this world that God made and upholds and now is directing by the power of his Spirit? What does wisdom look like? It's not a plug and chug sort of machine. And this is where, having a sacramental theology that informs everything is, I mean, everyone has a sacramental theology that informs everything. If you have a mechanistic sacramental theology, then you end up with a mech. And I think that's what happened is there was a, you had the growth of a mechanistic understanding of the sacraments. So the way God works in the world.
Explain that. You said a growth of a mechanism.
Mechanistic in the High Middle Ages, you started getting almost a materialism in the sacramental theology, right? So the question started to become, what is this bread and wine made of? Is it made of the body and blood of Christ, right? So it's a material question that they ask about the bread and the wine, and in the high medieval Roman Catholic Church. And then it made sense that if it is the material body and blood of Christ, well, what would you do if Jesus stepped into the room? You'd bow down to him. And so they said, well, we bow down to the bread, we bow down to the wine, and it makes sense in that system. But they're asking material questions of rituals and metaphors. So it's a poetic dullness that takes over, and begins to inform the cosmological understanding of things. So
you mean the lack of ability to be able to see the poetry in the thing, so they apply what they should do to the situation. I got
exactly.
You.
So and the Protestants said, well, no, first off, we're told not to bow down to any created thing, right? So so when they look around and they see the bowing down, that causes problems for them in the Mass.
It's first and second commandment stuff right there. Yeah.
Right. First and second commandment stuff. And then they say, and where are we getting this particular mechanistic understanding? Well, it turns out it's Aristotles' cosmology, that the mechanistic aspects of his cosmology so it's from Aristotle's book, believe it's called Aristotle's Physic, or his Physics, that the cosmological or metaphysical understanding is coming into the supper from, right? So, and that book hadn't been available in the early Middle Ages. It had come in so the African scholars, in the Muslim African scholars, had gotten very attached and protected Aristotle's works, and then when you started getting exchanges between the universities, the Muslim and Christian universities in the early 1000, around the turn of the millennium 1000, you started getting exchanges. Christian professors would go down and study and bring back books, and Muslim professors would come up and study and then at Christian universities and bring back books. It was very there was some really great scholars and exchange of scholars. Well, one of the things that came up was Aristotle. Aristotle does a really good job of revealing the inconsistencies of Plato's cosmology, right? Plato's understanding of the way the universe holds together, and then our place in it, and in particular, Plato's definition of knowledge, which is that you have to have direct knowledge of a thing that isn't knowledge that is mediated by anything else. Your mind has to have direct knowledge of the essence of a thing for it to be called real knowledge in Plato. Aristotle points out that that's impossible, and when he points out the impossibility of it, you start getting the realization in Christendom that actually is a definition of God's knowledge. So Plato is only calling what God, the kind of knowledge God has, true knowledge. And then he says, unless we have that, you can't call it knowledge. And then he says, and you can get that through philosophy and mathematics and different things. Well, Aristotle points out, actually, there is no unmediated knowledge of a thing. You can have direct knowledge of a thing, but it's all mediated. And so that's a good switch in the right direction, away from some of Plato's bad assumptions about knowledge towards a better assumption about knowledge. But Aristotle brings a cosmology with him in which the essence and the accidents of a thing are both within the thing itself. And so you end up with a mechanistic cosmology that makes it possible for Christians in the 1400s to have to embrace a mechanistic understanding of the Lord's Supper, and then that leads to some worshiping of it, which I think brings about the judgment of the Black Plague on Europe and all that. But that's a different question.
Is it
what
though?
you end up
Is it though?
It's not,
though?
but I because I think that's always the question, right? These things have consequences because we have a personal God, right? Who's
They got the supper wrong and judgment happened. I don't know, bro.
I don't think it's that they got the supper wrong. It's that they started bowing down, right? It's the idolatry.
That's kind of getting it wrong,
right? Well, but you have people that they're just trying to work out a theological understanding that would never in their imagination, it wouldn't enter into it to bow down and worship it, right? They're trying to say, okay, well, if Plato's wrong, how do we conceive of it, right? How do we put together a conception? And Aristotle presents a conception, and they say, well, here's a conception, and they say, here's a conception of how God is working upon us, because that's the question that how is it that we are having fellowship with the Lord in the supper? That's they know that they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they start asking those questions and trying to come up with a conception of fellowship, and they end up with a mechanistic conception of fellowship that has to involve physical interaction for it to be considered real fellowship. And so and then later they say, well, okay, let's bow down to it then. And I think that the judgment of God comes upon the bowing down to created things in that. So I mean, it's you see this sort of the worship of the Lord is the heart of a culture, right? The worship of their God is the heart of the culture. It appears to be more dangerous to claim, historically speaking, to claim Christ and then worship created things while claiming that they are Christ than to just worship created things without pretending to be Christian, right? So
Yeah.
in
Actually,
terms of the
that's a
judgments
really
of
good
God in
point.
history,
That's actually
right?
a really
So
good point.
yeah,
That's a really good point, though. I mean, because then it's putting the responsibility. It's almost it's putting the responsibility on God's chosen people to disciple the rest of the nations to be this particular way. And so, if judgment is going to start somewhere, it's going to start with those people
right.
who have been told and have special revelation of how to act. So then their duties and responsibilities are higher and greater than the rest of the
Yeah.
world.
So if you look at a judgment like the French Revolution, you have the the purposeful choosing of uh, the idolatrous aspects of the mass over against the Huguenots, um, and that leads to the French Revolution, right? That leads to the destruction of the royal houses of France. When the royal houses of France um, make a claim, well, for power's sake, we're choosing the mass over over against the Huguenots, right? Whereas before there was room for the Huguenots to continue in worship and the Roman Catholics to continue in worship, and it was just going to be a question of let's work on this together until we can um, come to a conclusion, right? Well, when the king says a mass is worth the power of France, France is worth a mass, you end up with the French Revolution. Right? So, the destruction of the royal houses of France.
Okay, so we've been talking
Because
now.
God is personal, right? Because so oh, then and which what but then what ends up happening is there's a that mechanistic understanding. There are some Protestants that resist it and say, no. You've got the mechanistic understanding is wrong, right? It's a spiritual. We live in a spiritual world. That's the wrong cosmology, the wrong metaphysic. We and the we know that God fellowships with us, that Christ Himself gives Himself and fellowships with us in the supper, that Christ Himself is present in baptism. That's all true, and it's not a physical thing; it's a spiritual thing. It's by the power of the Holy Spirit. Christ makes Himself present and presents Himself to us to be embraced by faith, and then we have real, true fellowship and communication. Uh, in the older sense, life together. That old communion, communication. The heart of the words communion and communication are you have a deep connection between the two. So, but what ends up winning out is a different view of the supper, which agrees on the mechanistic understanding, but says it doesn't happen, right? So you've got the Roman Catholics that say, unless Jesus, His body and blood is physically present in the supper, it's not real communion. It's not real. It's just a memorial. And they say, therefore, and we know it's not just a memorial, therefore Christ must be really present, physically present and they have an Aristotelian understanding of how that can work, that the accidents stay the same, but the essence changes. Uh, Therefore, it is real communion. But then you've got on the other side, Protestants say, well, no, it's just an ordinance. Unless Christ is really physically present in the supper, it's not a sacrament. Christ cannot be really physically present in the supper because of his indivisible human nature, and that the lack of commingling between his human and divine natures because of the creeds. Therefore, he's not truly present in the supper, and so it's a just an ordinance and not a sacrament. That ends up winning out in most of Western Protestantism and on the Roman Catholic side. So they end up with a shared cosmology that leaves the world open to ideology, because now you've got a mechanistic understanding.
You got to
of the
backfill
world.
it. You got to backfill this
You've
thing.
got to
Something's got to be
backfill
in
it with a
charge.
new idea. So you've got to replace the continued presence of the Holy Spirit doing the work of Christ, who is the king of this place, right, with some other force. And so you get economic force, and then the laissez-faire capitalists debate with the Marxists on which economic force is the most powerful, and is there a and Marx is the progressive, meaning he's the post-millennial version of that ideology, and the laissez-faire capitalists are the what, maybe
fundamentalists.
fundamentalists. Okay. Yeah, they're maybe the amillennial or the premillennial version of that ideology, but they're the same ideology, just with different eschatologies, right? Or you get you get Darwin, who's the biological. His ideology is a biology. Is biological.
You get all of that from the supper.
You get all of those things from what I think was a failure to a failure of an understanding of the kind of world that the supper tells us we live in. That baptism you gotta tells us that we live in. It's a covenantal world.
The kind of sacrament that you have determines the kind of world that you live in.
Right.
Did they know? Well, we don't look at our political, cultural realities that we have now and say, oh, we have the sacraments wrong.
Because we don't believe we live in an integrated universe anymore, right? Our cosmology tells us that they're not connected.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, because go ahead.
Because they don't touch. Right.
Right. Exactly.
It's a physics-based cosmology.
Explain. Yeah. Well, so you're saying that if it's Gnostic, right? If go ahead. I'm still working that out.
So most people's cosmology, if you want to change power structures, you've got to run for office. Right. Because unless you touch the power structure, you can't influence it.
Because of the Machiavellian structure that we have right now. Because the Machiavellian powers all in one place.
Machiavellian universe that all there is matter and power. So this isn't. It's not that there wasn't that these ideas don't begin to present themselves before the 1700. It's just that because Machiavelli, he's with 15th century to the 1400s, I believe, and he's presenting these ideas already. They gain no traction until there is a cosmology, until the shared cosmology can make it so that most people can have a gut reaction to Machiavellianism that says, yeah, that makes sense, right? So if there's only matter and power, you can't affect the matter over on that other side of the room without going over and touching it, physically touching it somehow, right? So the illusion that the interconnectedness of everything is he has to be physical if there's going to be an interconnectedness. Where if I'm going to have an effect on the world, it has to be. If it's indirect, it's because I influence the thing that influences, or something like that. There is no
supernatural reality. There is no supernatural realities behind it, right?
And unfortunately, most Christians are naturalists in their cosmology and assumptions and the way they live.
So, Jason, is this also why we have a problem with faith and works too?
I mean, I think so. I think it's
because
go ahead.
It seems like that, when I read the book, J. Gresham Machen's What is Faith? It's so simple, but it took a minute, I think, for that to kick in. And it really happened around, well, there's so many areas that happen, but when God says something, the only rational thing to do is to operate in what he says. That's the only rational way to live in the world. So if God says, I'm going to make you a great...
If it's a world made of his words.
That's the only one I can assume it exists.
Right, exactly. And, and we're assuming something else if we do something else.
Right. But faith is then believing that, even though the perceived reality or world that you live in, whatever you think, you don't see, except that you do when you see trees and you see the ground and you see the heavens and you see the water and you see yourself. I mean, you can't help it. Faith is pretty easy if you understand that. Yeah.
Right. And this is I one of my favorite passages in the New Testament is in the book of Hebrews, when he says, but we see Jesus, right? He says, so he starts off by saying, all things have been put under his feet. He said, now we look around and we don't see yet all things put under his feet, but we see Jesus seated at the right hand of the Father, right? So he says, when you look at Jesus, can you imagine everything not coming under his feet? Can you imagine him not the King of Kings, not the Lord of Lords? Can you imagine him not having all authority in heaven? Of course you can't. Not when you see him, right? I mean, this is Augustine's definition of regeneration. His definition of conversion is God opening your eyes to the beauty, majesty, authority, and power of Jesus. Right? When you see Jesus, everything else that you don't yet see happening, it so influences and shifts your imagination to the point that you can't imagine it happening any other way than Jesus ending up Lord of all things, and Jesus having everything under his feet, right? But we see Jesus
but that actually is reality. Seeing Jesus is reality. That's the world that really exists. That's the real world, and everything else is fake, false. It's not real, right? And so the way you operate then is in the real world with complete view of Christ. So you operate. So it's what caused Abraham to leave. Right? It's what he believed God and he operated. And so we have this disconnect between operation and belief, as if we operate, somehow we're not believing, because I don't know how, I don't see it any other way anymore. I don't even know how I saw it any different before. Because anytime God says something, this is what I think, people really have, I mean, sorry to go here, I'm gonna have to go here, but it's one of the perfect examples of infant baptism. What has been the promise that God has said? And then if you believe what God has said, then you act in a way that grabs onto that reality and operates in that way. So God has promised your family to 1,000 generations, to those who believe, right? So then you do family worship, then you pray with your kids, and then, because you're not trying to hope for something that's not going to happen, you see Christ. That's the reality of the situation. And so having faith, and it's so funny, I think we were talking about this. I've watched people who hear the promises of God, say that they believe the promises of God, and then when something of the outcome comes out different, what they don't do is doubt their faith to believe it. What they do is doubt the promises of God.
Right.
They had the faith. Right? Oh, I had the faith. But then the reality, which one's broken? Is it the promises of God or is it you? Which one?
Right.
Somebody had a fracture here.
Yeah. Or we say, wait, did I get it right? Right. So, and this is the John the Baptist. He sends his disciples and he says, did I get it right, Jesus? Because
I'm turning out the way I thought.
Yeah, it's not going the way I thought. Did I get it right? Which is a legitimate question. There are times, because he's a God that raises the dead, there's going to be times when you say, this grave, this is what you want me to crawl into? Did I get this right? Right. This is, but that's what it comes down to over and over is, wait, what does God promise? Did I get it right? Okay. What does it look like to live like that promise is true? That to live out of the overflowing love of God by faith when it looks like you're outside of it, or you haven't, when it looks like maybe you've gotten to the edges of it or something like that. But this is where the older cosmology that says, what's going on here? What is this place? This place is the overflowing love of God, right? Why do I exist? Because of the overflowing love of God.
Can I just step back for a second?
Yeah.
I know you're going to, but I got to say, when we talk about the overflowing love of God, we're talking about the Trinity in eternity past spilling out over itself into creation, right? Like that, we're talking about that kind of overflowing love of God. It can't be contained, right? Like that's it. And so out of that overflow, we exist. Right? Like that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, this is C.S. Lewis from the Four Loves. I was just reading this this morning. So, God, who needs nothing, loves into existence wholly superfluous creatures.
Wow.
In order that he may love and perfect them. He creates the universe already foreseeing, or should we say seeing? There are no tenses in God. The buzzing cloud of flies about the cross, the flayed back pressed against the uneven stake, the nails driven between the mesial nerves, the repeated incipient suffocation as the body droops, the repeated torture of back and arms as it is time after time, for breath's sake, hitched up. If I may dare the biological image, God is a host who deliberately creates his own parasites, causes us to be that we may exploit and take advantage of him. Herein is love. This is the diagram of love himself, the inventor of all loves. That is a different cosmology than Machiavellianism, or any. This is a cosmology that says, why is this place love? God's love. It's overflowing to the point that he says, I'm going to create this place where I know that when I go, they're going to beat me and torture me. But that's going to be also the means of salvation, right? That the Son goes to the cross for the joy that's set before him, right? For the love that he has for the Father, for all of those. Right? It's just a different sort of place altogether.
Wow, it makes you look at it and have to deal with it in that type of context. It changes everything. It doesn't, all the stuff that happens stays the same, but your perspective of all of it shifts to see it like,
right.
Oh, so then now as a father who has come home to his home that's out of order, all he sees is, this is the kind of world that God has made where I get to go love, and my love overflows into the mess.
Right. Yeah.
This is the kind of place where you see politics out of order and completely insane, and you're like, ooh, love.
Right. And because you can go into the broken situations with joy in this kind of world, right? You can't go into broken situations with joy in if in a mechanistic world, because if you don't fix it, it's done.
Okay, so I gotta talk to you about my New Year's resolutions. Did I tell you about them? The 3 R's I've been talking about them.
I don't think you've told me about them in that context.
I went on Whitlock and even Cross Politic and 3 R's. One is repentance, recovery, and then remembrance. Those are the 3 R's that I came up with. And repentance, I think, almost like what we're just talking about for the last hour, that there's some massive repentance that I think I need to bring into to the floor. I need to get on my knee because I'm not seeing God's world, and more and more we talk, the more and more I'm repenting, because I'm like, man, if I would have spent my first 20 so years, 30 years on the planet thinking about the world that way, I would have reacted so differently to the world, and my attitude and my heart would have been filled with more joy and more fight and ordered of my families and my wife and it just would have been, I would have reacted completely different to it. And so there's some repentance that needs to go there, which I'm praising God for, because the fact that you are repenting means that God is bringing this to you, which is like, oh, thank you, Lord. So I don't have to stay in that situation anymore. So repentance has been huge, and been thinking about that a lot. And then recovery. And this is where I want to talk to you about, because recovering rightly ordered loves, that is, I think we talk about that we need to have rightly ordered loves, but then how do you get that? How do you reorder your loves? And if you can, I think what we do is we identify loves and then we say, hey, go love it. But it's like, I don't think that we're so part of in what you're talking about and how we've been having this conversation. Part of what we really need to do is reorder our love to the way that God has made the world. Some of the ways that I've seen that is in a love for we've talked about this with Tolkien, and how Tolkien,
yeah, Tolkien,
how he loved hierarchy.
Yeah.
And because he loved something, he wrote his piece, Lord of the Rings. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know how to love that well. I know that I should love it. I know that it's there to be loved, but then how do you love those, how do you rightly place your loves, and how do you love those things so that it comes out of you?
Yeah, because hating the wrong thing, or because hating something that you should hate, gets you into a fight, but loving something that you should love gets you into a building project.
And it makes you a jolly warrior.
It does, yeah.
And
you're not writing
it's easy to hate
poetry. Something. Yeah, hatred doesn't get you writing poetry, right? It doesn't get you building up. Yeah.
It doesn't have a certain sort of belly laugh to it that makes atheists say, wait a second, I got to question myself.
Wait a second. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. It doesn't. And so where do you start at rightly? Because I feel like if I can get my loves rightly ordered and to the place where I can love them, then I'm not as easily reflexive to the world. So right now I watch secularists do things, and pagans and even Republicans do things that really get us reacting. And I think it's a good thing that we have parents who care about their children's education, and the fact that the LGBTQ movement has integrated themselves right inside of the schools and the education system, and they're fighting against that. I'm grateful for that. But then there's a different type of rightly ordered loves that never lends your kids to that type of environment anyway.
Right.
Right.
Well, and I think that's, hating something, it gets you, it gets you defensive, and there are things that are worth defending, but it doesn't make you productive. It doesn't get you building. And that's where You're not saying, you're saying, I don't want my kids getting that education. But that's different than saying, here's the education I really want to give my kids. Here's what I love and I want them to
Right.
love. Right. Here's what is beautiful that I want them to experience because it's beautiful. And once they experience the beauty of it, then they won't be susceptible to the ugly lies. And the we don't have that right now in
How do
our
you
culture as
how
a
do
whole.
you how do you develop that? Oh, you don't have to have a drink on that, huh? Might need some bourbon.
Yeah. Well, since you warned me that we were going to talk about this, I actually have
Yeah.
I went and got my
What is that?
this is the Nicene and post-Nicene fathers. Right. This is the
Okay.
church fathers set. I think you have the church fathers set. I thought. Haven't we
No,
talked about
but
that?
no. We also have a book list we got to talk about. I got
We do.
how
So
many books did we
so
took?
this
So the Nicene Church Father said.
well, this is volume 2 of the Nicene and post-Nicene fathers. So it's the big church fathers set. Philip Schaff put it together.
Oh yeah, you talked about that. Yeah,
Yeah. So, and a lot of people
expensive.
buy it. It is expensive, and for most people, it's really expensive wallpaper, right? Because they put it up there, and they never read it. But it's so good, and I hope that I have bought a lot of sets, and then want and used them and read them, and discovered that a lot of people buy a lot of sets for decorations. But don't do that. If you get the church fathers, you can literally just grab any volume and read it. Philip Schaff does such a good job of putting together what is important and useful for the church. But this is from On Christian Doctrine. My introduction to Saint Augustine. It might have been On Christian Doctrine. It might have also been the Enchiridion, which was the book that he wrote for people getting ready for baptism. Which is the one that I think I put on our book list for the year. I went back and forth between these two, but in On Christian Doctrine, chapter 1, verse in book 1, chapter 27, the chapter is called The Order of Love. It says, now he is a man of just and holy life who forms an unprejudiced estimate of things and keeps his affections also under strict control, so that he neither loves what he ought not to love, nor fails to love what he ought to love, nor loves that more which ought to be loved less, nor loves that equally which ought to be loved either less or more, nor loves that less or more which ought to be loved equally. No sinner is to be loved as a sinner, and every man is to be loved as a man for God's sake. And this is where love the sin, hate the sin, love the sinner, hate the sin comes from. It's from this quote from Augustine on Christian Doctrine. But God is to be loved for his own sake. And is God to be loved more than any man? Each man ought to love God more than himself. Likewise, we ought to love another man better than our own bodies, because all things are to be loved in reference to God. And another man can have fellowship with us in the enjoyment of God, whereas our body cannot. For the body only lives through the soul, and it is by the soul that we enjoy God. So that's the 27th chapter of the first book of Augustine's book on doctrine. And the first 26 chapters leading up to it are explaining what it is for our affections to be rightly ordered, or our loves to be rightly ordered. And at the center of it, he even mentions it here. He says, God can be loved for his own sake. Everything else has to be loved in reference to God. Right. So everything, you can't love a turkey sandwich for its own sake. You have to love a turkey sandwich as a gift from God. Right? So, and whereas if you loved a turkey sandwich the same way that you love God, you'd be idolizing. It'd be idolatry. Whereas God, you don't love God for what you love God because of who he is and in and of himself and because of what he's done. You love God for his own sake. Everything else has to be loved in relationship to God. And so that's the center of what it means to order our loves aright, is that we love God for his own sake above everything else. And he's using a kind of moral reasoning that Aristotle develops in the Nicomachean Ethics, that says, when you that asks the question, what is this thing for? And so if I'm going to love it, if I'm going to use it rightly, I have to love it for what it's for, right? So I can, so I think
Well, that right
food
there,
is,
bro, you got that right there. Woo, we can flesh that out. I think we took a whole
well,
year to try and flesh that out last year.
I think so, and I think that's because that's the question that we don't ask anymore, right? So, um, uh, alcohol is, I think, a really good example, right? If you've got a glass of wine and you ask yourself, what is this thing for? Um, how do I love this glass of wine? You have to say, well, what's it for? If I just pound it as quickly as possible to try and get drunk, then I'm misusing the wine. I'm not actually loving the wine as a gift from God, because that's not what it's for. Um, it's for the enjoyment of it. It is to make the heart happy, but we're told that drunkenness is not the same thing as that. But it's also for fellowship, right? So you can have a glass of wine at the end of the day to relax, and it's a gift from God. But you haven't yet reached the full use of wine yet, because wine is for fellowship, right? So there's another use on top of it to rightly love it. So if you only ever, I remember hearing um, a, a number of times from a number of different people that grew up in Christian homes that thought their parents didn't ever drink, but it was because their parents only ever drank in secret, because they were afraid of the judgment that would come from drinking. And so they end up missing out on one of the central things that wine does, which is it's a point of fellowship, right? God gave us wine so that we could fellowship with one another, right? As we sit around a bottle of wine and tell stories and enjoy one another's company, that wine becomes a means to an end.
You would pick that up in the sacraments.
Right. Well, yeah,
Communion.
exactly. Right. And so when God says, I'm going to have fellowship with you, and he gives us bread, and he says, bring bread and wine, right? Let's have fellowship together. The we have learned through the right use of wine the kind of thing that happens when two people sit down and drink and eat together. I remember, I think I've told this story before, but when my dad died, coming up, I think it's 15 years ago, when my dad died, we'd lived in the same house my entire life. Everyone from the neighborhood, my my dad was not a chatty person, but if you're if you're and he wasn't handy, he couldn't fix things, but if your water heater went down, my dad was going to be there to help you move it in, move it out, stand next to you while you banged on it to try and fix it, ride to the hardware store with you. But he wouldn't really, he wouldn't chat with you, but he was there. He was a presence. And my parents and then the parents on the other end of the block were the only two couples that didn't get a divorce over the course of my growing up, right? So lots of divorce on the block. But so my dad was steady, right? And over, people would stop in after after the funeral with brownies or cookies or salads, and just say, yeah, I can't, I know I can't hang out and be with you guys. I wish I could. Here's brownies. Eat these. because I wish I could be with you. And they would tell us stories about my dad, his steadiness, um, the 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 time he showed up to help even though he didn't know what he was doing and made it worse, and they appreciated that about him. And all those things. They tell stories and bring food because they couldn't be with us, but they wanted to be, right? And the food, and you'd eat the brownie and have fellowship with them in their absence, but they knew that they were giving themselves in a plate of brownies, because they were grieving with us. We know that food works that way. When you go to somebody's house and they feed you, they're not just feeding you. When you have a baby and somebody brings you food, they're giving themselves. It's not like, hey, you're the machine that you live in, your body needs fuel. Here's some fuel, and it's a pure exchange of energy that they're making sure you have it. They're giving themselves. There's a deep, God built a world in which many, many things are means of self-transfer, means of self-giving, where our self is transferable. We don't just we don't give our kids square protein blocks every night that have all of the things in them, right? We make a meal. We enjoy it together because there's a self transfer. There's a giving of self that is involved in food. We know it, right? We experience
this is why
it.
we got comments like, "Oh, you put your foot in this." Right. That's why we have those kind of comments. It's like, or it's like, whose soul did I just taste? This is what we call it soul food, right? We know that there's something in it that is a transfer of that person's, of who they are, and their
who
love
they are
is
to you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was at I was down at, there's a cool bar here in Spokane where it's a bookstore, but then there's a false wall in the back where you push open one of the bookcases and there's a hidden bar behind it. I love it. It's a cool little bar. And I was in there one evening. I was meeting my kids to pick them up, and have I told the story before? No, I can't remember. I tell all my stories over and over. And got talking with the bartender because it was just him and I in there, and I was just waiting for the meetup point. And we got telling stories and telling jokes, and then I said, well, hey, and he was like, well, hey, can I get you a drink? Right? Because now we're actually in fellowship. We're having fellowship. We're enjoying, he's telling me stories, and when he finds out, when he found out that I'm a writer, he wanted to tell me stories about the bar, right? He wanted to tell me stories about what's wrong with men these days, right? And that men don't grow up and it become men. They stay boys, and how he feels bad for all these girls that have to put up with the fact that all these boys are in here looking for a girl when they are women who need a man, right? And he's telling, but at this point we're having fellowship, and he doesn't feel right about me paying for a drink. And I noticed it at the time, and I have a sacramental theology that explains what's going on and explains why it would be rude. It would be rude. It would be me denying fellowship, denying that we're in fellowship to try and pay for it. Right.
Right.
He says, let me get you a drink. And he wanted to make me, I really like going in and ordering bartender's choice, when you are sitting at the bar, right? If you're sitting at a table or whatever, I just order an old fashioned, and that's what I like. But if I'm sitting at a bar with a bartender, I like to order bartender's choice. Make me something that you love to make. And he had a drink he wanted to make me, and then he came around the bar and he sat with me and we drank it. And I have a sacramental theology that explains what's going on and tells me what is the proper way to deal with the situation and to know what's going on. And we all know that is what is going on with food and drink. We experience it all the time. And I mean, this is the problem with drive-throughs. I like the convenience of drive-throughs, but then, everybody eats facing the same direction, not facing each other, and you're not bringing food to its proper use and end. I mean, one of its uses is
Sustenance, for
energy,
sure.
right? Sustenance, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a greater
It has
use, a
another.
greater end, right? I mean, this is the problem with Bud Ice, is that there's no good way for it to, yeah, it's not designed for fellowship anymore. So, or
That's,
Keystone
man, there's so much, just
Natural Ice or whatever.
there's so much I,
It's
I want to flesh out in there, because everything you said, there's overlaying things that are connected to that, with from food and fellowship to church, business. As you're talking about food, I'm thinking of the people who knew that food had a way of bringing people together, because they were the kind of people who brought people together. But they knew if they can taste this, I mean, we talked about this before, where you were in a restaurant, and somewhere in the South, I think it was, and there was fried chicken or something like that. You didn't know what to order on the menu, and you said people from every nationality were in this
yeah,
joint, in
and
fellow, and
every
this guy,
economic
yes, so it was,
stratosphere, yeah,
yeah, we're in this joint, and you were like, I don't know, and the guy leans over and tells you he'll have the, he orders for you, like he's family with you, because he's if you're there, it's because you want whatever is good, and he's like, well, I know what's good, brother, let me hook you up, and he knows
yeah,
he's
right,
expecting to have some sort of connection with you because of the food that you guys are going to eat together, and he
right,
knows it's that good that you guys are going to experience the intent of the chef to bring people together through this food. It's not
right,
just as simple, and it's funny. It makes the whole world interconnected when you start thinking about food, and not just food, but everything that you make for your neighbor. I was, as you
right,
were talking about this, I'm like, if this really is a transformational idea in economics, to say, I want to, from the outflow of my family and what we are gifted at, I want to make something for somebody else that benefits them in such a way that it unifies them to something, right? Like, it just, to someone, right? For that purpose. And all of a sudden you have a world operating completely different, you know? And, and, and so, but here's what I want to go back to, because I can go down that rabbit trail for a minute. So how do you then, so rightly ordering your love around God and the kind of world that he made and the things that he's
yeah,
done, take me there. So, because how do we really saturate ourselves in that, so that those things start coming out of us naturally? So
yeah.
does that make sense?
It does, yeah, and I think this is where the reasoning that Augustine uses to get to his conclusion, right? Because the conclusion is we need to rightly order our loves, right? Um, but the reasoning that he uses to get there helps us, is the actually the way to get there, is to begin working that reasoning out in our lives, and that is to you order your loves in terms of what is this thing for, um,
Going
and
back to
so
metaphysics, right?
back to metaphysics. So,
How do I properly
God,
love this thing, right?
right? How do I properly? So God, you love him for him, right? You love God for God. There's no use that you put God to, and there's no use that God is put to, right? He exists metaphysically apart from the creation, uh, and then he is by definition the greatest of all beings, right? So, I mean, there's an argument for his existence in that fact, because by definition, the God is by definition the greatest of all beings, and by definition, a being that exists is greater than a being that doesn't exist. So by definition, God must exist, right? I think you can argue that God exists from his definition. in this Augustinian setup, right? So if anybody says, hey, I need an argument for God's existence, I think there's an argument for God's existence in that, but that's totally an aside. So God can be loved for his own sake. There's no use
I
that you
see.
need to put God to.
You know, it gave me the you gave me the answer, but it was so simple I didn't see it as clearly. In loving God for God, you love everything in its relation to its creator.
Right,
Right.
exactly. So your neighbor, when you go to love your neighbor, you don't love your neighbor more than God. That doesn't make any sense, right? But what
Now
is
without
your
making your neighbor
neighbor?
God. Right.
Right, exactly. But what's your neighbor for? Well, he is the image of God, right? So what Augustine points out is that's why you love a man. When you love a man, you love him as the image of God, and not the sin in him, but that you can look at him and say, well, what's he for? Well, he's imaging God into the world. He's imaging God to me, right? So I love him as the image of God, and this is a lot of what ends up being called Christian humanism grows out of this understanding that everybody I meet, they are the image of God standing before me. So the way that I would love Christ if he was before me, I can love my neighbor that way. I can return the love that God has shown to me, that Christ has shown to me, to my neighbor who is made in his image. So it's an ordering of but then like, you know, a bowl of macaroni and cheese is not the image of God. I don't love it in the same sort of way, but I don't hate it, right? I still, I order the love that I have for that is a different sort of thing. It's a different sort of thing. And so if, let's say, a person gets between me and the bowl of mac and cheese that I want, if I have disordered the loves, then I'm going to be cruel to get this person out of the way so I can get to the bowl of mac and cheese that I want. Because but if you say, but look, macaroni and cheese is good, are you telling me I can't love macaroni and cheese? Well, you can't love it more than your neighbor, right? You can't love it more than your kids. You can't. But we do that all the time. We disorder our love, and we take something that's good, but that is not as good as something else, and we treated it as if it's better. So,
okay,
does that make sense?
No. It's making good sense. It's kind of the thing that's rubbing me somewhat about the Christian nationalism stuff is that I see there is an intention to rightly order loves, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what they're doing, it seems, is rightly ordering their love of their home and their people and their land over against another instead of within each other, right? So
Yeah, right. Yeah,
does that make sense?
right. Where it's a love that it's a rivalry that they're calling love, or they're describing a rivalry and calling it love.
So
Because it's nothing. So patriotism, if I say, well, yeah, I'm patriotic, I say, oh, so you want to bomb North Korea to smithereens? You say, no. That's not what patriotism is. So, well, but they're our enemy. So no, I love enemies too, right? That's part of what God has told me to do, is to love my enemies as well. I don't have to hate another people to love my people. That's not the way that it works. That's if that's the way an idolatrous love works. That's if you put I think of it like, loving God is a box truck that everything else can fit into. If we try to love something else like God, then we have to then we have a very small box truck and not a lot of things fit into it. But love, when God's love is at the top, everything else can fit
How about a
into it and
separate,
properly ordered.
a separate truck? Right? There's only enough room in one. The guy that's his own separate thing on his own. That nothing else fits into that one.
Right.
But
Well,
then
because
you have the world.
God is a yeah. Well, because God is a different sort of. This is where when Maximus the Confessor says God is not a thing, this is what he's
Right.
talking about. He's a different sort of being. He is an uncreated being. So loving him actually makes room. Loving him in that sort of way, in and of himself, for his own sake, that makes that there's room in that to when you put everything else in its proper order to fit the love of everything else. If you try to love something else in that way, you don't have room. You end up having to have a rivalry with other things.
What would I write down? And this
is what is hard about the Christian nationalism thing for me as well, because what I have seen is the Christian nationalists are on a mission, right? And you're with them or you're against them. And so, if somebody, so to say what I have seen in their rhetoric is that if you are not with them, then you must hate America, or you must hate white people, or you must hate, their whatever it is that they are identifying as their nation. Because I don't think that is even clear at this point. It's an ideology. It's an ism. It's not even really something specific. But it's the same sort of way when somebody loves their town, I love Spokane. And if somebody comes along and they're like, man, I love my town over New Orleans. Yeah, I love New Orleans. And they describe their love of New Orleans, and I recognize it. Like, oh, that's the way I feel about my town. And they say, no, you can't love your town because it's not New Orleans. Well, then they're idolizing New Orleans, right? If other people's, it's like if you love your mom and I love my mom, and you feel like my love of my mom is a threat to your love of your mom, then you've idolized your mom. Then that's not the right way to love your mom. It's the same with your city,
Jason,
same with your nation.
Jason, somebody's mom is better.
Right.
And that's just a fact. I'm just gonna let you know right now. Because if my mama listening, she the best. I'm just gonna say it right now.
I agree.
No, but I
agree with that sentiment completely. If my mama's listening, she's the best.
Yeah, I don't think that you're right. There is, when you actually have God rightly placed and you understand that reality, you can say those are actually both true. She is absolutely the best. Your mom is absolutely the best. My mom is absolutely the best. And there's a reality to that, and a poetic way of understanding that is absolutely true. And had God wanted there to be super mom that's the best of all, he would have had some sort of design or way to say, okay, best moms of all right here. This is it. That's not how he's gave us moms, right?
Yeah.
To serve us individually the best possible way that we could be served. And no other mom can serve me and my brothers and sisters better than the one that God gave me. But that's because God has set it up that way,
Right.
And there isn't a nation that could serve me better than the one that God gave me, right? God put me in America. This is sovereignty of God kind of stuff, right? This is God's sovereign in his action doing something.
It is. And this is where but here's where I think the rubber hits the road. Did you see that? Oh, you sent me the Jonah Hill, Eddie Murphy movie.
Yes. It's basically the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the new one.
Yeah, exactly. It's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. You people. It looks, I haven't laughed at a trailer so hard in a long time.
I'm gonna go see that.
I am too. But I think that's like rubber meets the road stuff. When the dad is like, we're big fans of Louis Farrakhan, you know him? And the mom is like, oh, I know him. Oh, I know him. I know what he says about the Jews.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's such a perfect setup, right? It's really, really good. But you know
who wrote that, right?
Jonah Hill, didn't he?
Jonah Hill and the guy from Black AF. Those two guys.
Oh man.
That's why I'm going like, okay.
Makes me want to see it even more.
Exactly.
I'm glad you made me watch Black AF, but not because I have ever recommended it to anyone, but because
I haven't either.
As a writer, you've got to be seen. But that's a good example, I think, where when you have somebody that says, hey, I love my nation. I love even, I love my people, and they get a weird definition of what that is or something. It breaks down. It's the Romeo and Juliet problem. If your son falls for a girl that is not a part of however you have defined your people, and your response is, you've turned on us, then there's a problem, right? Then you've got an idolatry problem. Because even Solomon, who's the wisest man of all, when he says, there are some things I don't understand, 6 yea 7, one of them he lists as the way of a man and a maid, right? He says, what makes a guy and a girl fall for each other? Completely, absolutely mysterious and beyond anything but what the Holy Spirit can explain. It's a strange, mysterious force that crosses boundaries, that crosses oceans, boundaries, mountains, valleys, and it's a force that has yet to be thoroughly explained. And that Romeo and Juliet is based on a story that goes all the way back into the ancient world, of a guy and a girl from competing tribes that fall for one another, and it means their love is doomed because the parents can't see. The parents have so bought into the rivalry that it is considered, that the rivalry is considered the basis of the reality of the relationship between the tribes. And Christians just should have nothing to do with that, right? So you can love your people group, you can love your language group, whatever it is. If you say, and my kid better not ever marry outside of it, you've turned it into an idol, plain and simple. Because God, because every boundary is built to be crossed. Period. That's every phenomenological, physical boundary is built to be crossed because it's a covenantal world, right? So this is why, I'm not saying that a Christian should marry a non-Christian, because that's a covenantal boundary. That's a real boundary. Every other boundary is an illusion that God set up so he can prove the fundamental nature of the covenants.
The fact that you even had to say that, if somebody else thought that you meant anything different, doesn't understand the context of the conversation we're even having.
Yeah.
Like I know, but I know you had to say it. I know you had to say it because I think in terms a lot of times of our listeners, and I know that they had to say, wait a second, there's a boundary here, but the context in which we're having the conversation isn't outside of covenant realities. That's the only conversation we're having, right?
It's the conversation we've been having the whole time. Yeah.
Because that's reality. I was listening to,
but you know how this works, right? Is somebody's going to say, I'm going to send this to my Christian nationalist friend, and he's going to say, like, what, he's okay with him marrying non-Christians because they're in love.
Right. Oh, and here's I got to say this too, because I fit inside of that If somebody looked from the outside and said, what is Knox? They would easily identify me as a Christian nationalist. I fit inside that brand, inside of that group, the way that people look at it. And I'm fine with that. I don't have a problem with that in one sense. So long as I'm getting a chance to define what we're talking about and what we mean by that. This is why I appreciate some of the guys in the conversation that are trying to do their best job to define it up against what I think Marjorie Taylor Greene means by the idea, and what Yiannopoulos thinks about the idea, and what some of the other people are considering it to be. I appreciate the conversation that they're trying to have in structuring it. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that well if we're not starting at the right place. And I think that conversation, because right now, here's what I'm finding that people are really trying to do. People have realized that the guards that they had from yesteryear are broken, and the definition of Christianity doesn't exist the way that it used to in America. My point is, it wasn't really that good to begin with there, where you thought, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Eugene Rosenstock Hussey put his finger on it coming out of World War II, saying, hey guys, it's gone. Right. That's how long it's been gone. Those cultural definitions of public institutions, I think in America, it's been gone since shortly after the Civil War.
Yeah, actually, I think you're whatever, man. That's a whole.
But in the rest of Christendom, it took a little bit longer to finally lose its public institutions.
Are we? Yeah, I have to go ahead.
Should I say something really controversial?
Go ahead. Why not?
Yeah, why not? I think that Edmund Burke put his finger on it when he pointed to America and said, allowing slavery to exist puts you outside of Christendom. I think that's actually.
Why is that controversial?
I don't know. Don't you think it's controversial?
No, I don't think that you can. You are destroying the second table of the law completely and asking for God's blessing on something, like this that's what leads to the Civil War, a part of it. Yeah, because if you can't understand humanity right, then how do you understand property? How do you understand?
Right. Well, but I think I'm thinking in an official legal situation. Not just theologically. I think that I don't
separate those two in the same way. Maybe.
Yeah, so I could see that, but I do think that that decision to say that's the equivalent of leaving the back door open on the submarine.
Absolutely.
Right.
I don't think that's radical to say, though.
Yeah. And I honestly think we had an opportunity. We had an opportunity, 100 years into the country to say, hey, let's lock the submarine and turn the pumps on. And the church balked. The church wasn't willing to give up what it thought of as its position of power in the public square. And the reason there is no church in the public square now is because when the church was in the public square and the conviction came to that we're outside of the legal tradition of Christendom, we're outside of the moral tradition of Christendom, we're outside of the historic public witness of Christianity by not opposing slavery, we guaranteed that 100 years later there would be no church in the public square.
I want to parallel a story real quick and tell on myself and really get myself in trouble. Okay. Knox is not perfect. I don't know if y'all know that. That's a reality, Jason. You know me, so it's true. But so think of everything you just said about this, the foundation of America, missing that moment. Okay, hold that right there. When I got married, me and my wife, we didn't have kids for the first 2 years. And part of it was, I'm gonna tell this part of the story too. When we got married, people in our community, in our family, thought we were getting married because they thought Sharon was pregnant, which is a horrible, horrible thing to think, that I would only marry her because she was pregnant. But not that I loved her and I thought she was beautiful and I wanted her to be my wife. And so they felt like the only way that we would be together if there was some sort of other thing tying us, which when you think about it, it's kind of like, well, good. Okay, you guys, you didn't go through the process right the first time, but at least you guys are finishing up and you're finishing strong. Way to go. That wasn't even a thing. So we intentionally were trying not to get pregnant the first 2 years so we can like squash those realities so people could be like, all right, no, I guess they must really love each other. We wanted to stop that narrative. But my point in bringing this up was that when Sharon got pregnant, she was working. She's a receptionist for the Minnesota Twins. When Sharon got pregnant, she was working, I was working, and we were finally getting financially ahead. And I enjoyed the fact that we had this income of money that was taking care of our debt, bringing us to a new place in life. We were saving. We could do whatever we wanted, whenever we wanted. And when she got pregnant, Sharon, just like a switch, she's like, I'm not working anymore. I don't want to work anymore. When we have the baby, I want to come home. And in my head, I was thinking, wait, we're going to lose this amount of money that she's making every year. We're not going to be able to have as much money. Maybe her grandma can babysit. But I looked at the price of it. It's like, well, that's about the same price as Sharon's full paycheck just to worry about a daycare. You know, it's the same price. But okay, so how do we work this? And so I wasn't moving on budging on her continuing to work. And she wanted to come home. It was clear for her. I want to be home. I want to raise my child. And I'm like, yeah, I want you to too, but we get ahead. And then maybe after 2 years, we'll be where we need to be at. And then, you know, and I remember I was working at Wretched at this time and I was going to work and I was hearing that whole week towards the end, she's middle of pregnancy at this point. And the conviction of God came over me about the duties and responsibilities of my wife to her child and to our family and to God. And I just heard sermons and I'm editing the sermons. I'm producing the show. So I'm editing the sermons. I'm hearing them. And then one day it's just struck me like a piano fell on top of me. And I'm in my office crying because I'm fighting the nature that God has designed her for and to be so that I could have what it is that I wanted in wealth or in things or goods or cars. I saw the future financially. That's the goal. And because I idolized that and made that what I wanted for our family, get us ahead, we'd be better than where we were before, I'm missing out on the blessing that my wife can give to us that's greater in the raising of my daughter to fear and honor God. And I came home and I was just like, baby, I'm sorry. As soon as you want to, you're done. You'll come home, you'll raise this kid. I'll figure it out. Because part of it was too, is I wasn't trusting God that the way that he made me, I can go and get it. You know, I wasn't trusting, or I didn't want to work as hard, whatever it was. I wasn't seeing that, hey, I could do this. And instead I was putting the pressure on her to do these things instead of saying, oh, God has made you for this task, designed you. Your body is designed to do the very thing that you want to do. And you're in line with it. And I'm the one that's out of line. I came back and I repented. And I repented. God opened up the opportunity to replace her income fully with a job for me.
That's amazing.
It was amazing, but I couldn't see it. I didn't have faith to believe that. God convicted me in the whole thing. I brought that story up to say this. When America got started, your beginning nation, slavery was how you made money. It's how you built the nation. Every nation was built off of it. And the ability not to see that God could build a nation apart from it.
Right.
Just being obedient to what God has said. If they would have taken that into more consideration in the beginning and believe and had faith to believe God, you would have gotten a whole nother kind of influx of people that would have come in and still did something and did it greater with unity had they followed through with what they knew to be right and repented, right? And so that's my point. It's like, I know, and this is something too, like repentance, when you are in the middle of a battle and you're not trusting in God, and you don't believe that God is who he says he is and how he's made the world, and you're like, I just don't see how we're going to make it. That is constant, the challenge. That's the same challenge Abraham had when he went to go sacrifice. I'm going to kill my son. Right.
Right.
I don't know how I'm going to get another one, but This is what God said to do. I'm going to believe God, right? And I know that God is going to work this out for good in the end. We don't have that kind of mentality towards things, and so then we never see the mighty hand of God. We need to be still, be obedient, trust God, and watch him break things. He's professional at filling them. He will break it and he will fill it and reform it. And matter of fact, he did that in Genesis, and then he did it again with Jesus, right? He broke Christ, and then now the whole world is made anew from the resurrection. And we got to remember that type of breaking is how God does things. And what God had to do in that instance for me was break me. I was the thing that needed to be broken. And I can tell you, man, ever since we've been 17 years now, going on 18 years, I believe, not once has God not provided for us. And Sharon's been home ever since then and has only managed the home. And that blessing has been richer to me than any amount of money that I thought I could have made from her working. You know, and I believe that the blessings of God would have been overflowing in a lot of ways, even greater. I think that God has kept us, and we've had, because of the gospel, has checked that rejection in some ways, or lack of obedience, so that now slavery's ended. It wasn't perfect, but God worked it out and is moving us in time and space towards the end of all things bowing to Jesus Christ, right? But man, you're going to do it anyway. You might as well do it being obedient.
right. Well, and I think, and I do think that even the end of slavery, it removed the church from its public position, but it didn't remove Christians from their influence. Right. So
that's right.
So there still has been a lot of blessings, because we always live in a world of layered jurisdictions. There's always the opportunity for God to give overflowing blessings, without.
It's a world made of love, right?
Yeah, it's a world made of love. So I think even being able to look back and say, man, we messed that one up.
And God still used it.
We believe, God still uses it for good. And we believe in a God that raises the dead. You know, that's the whole reason that Abraham could take Isaac up, is because he knew that God raised the dead. That's what Hebrews tells us. So I think it's going to be, I think the next turn is going to be really interesting to see in America, because I do think there's a lot of repentance going on, but that doesn't make the news.
You know, that's what's been interesting about watching the 20. I mean, if you pay attention to the story, and you're God's always telling the story, the 20 representatives in the House, that's an interesting story, right? You have McCarthy. I don't know how much you paid attention. I know you're not engaged in politics at all. Zero. But basically, the Speaker of the House had to get voted in 15 ballots before he became Speaker of the House, because there were 20 people on the Republican side in the Freedom Caucus that would not vote for him until there were some concessions made and some things that were changed. And they held up the vote for a couple days until he finally went on the 15th vote in the ballot. And it was some fighting. It was some backroom conversations, and these guys held out, and so that they can make some changes. And I thought about that. I'm like, it was ugly, and people were saying, oh, we can't run the government, and these things are going to be horrible. And I was thinking to myself, 20 people. That's all it took to, and so I don't know what 2023 is going to be. I'm not trying to be like a TD Jakes. 2023 is going to be the year. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to say it's inspiring to start off 2023 knowing that a Gideon type army has the effect on the society that way. That was encouraging. If nothing else, I'm like, I want other small things that we're doing. This is why I'm like, rightly ordered loves, and understanding that power isn't all in one place. Rightly ordered loves can have a massive impact on the direction that we go in this next year, in the next 15 years, the next 20 years, when we start creating and building and stop being faithless. I see a lot of faithless.
when that
moves and
I mean, I think also I've seen Christians that have started to realize, oh, I've got to move from critic to creator to become who I'm, who God's calling me to be. That I think is a huge sign, that every time the Spirit falls on a people, enormous amounts of music and art and poetry and uh inspirate in advances in business and science and all sorts of things come out of the creativity that the Spirit of God inspires. When you look around and see the creativity, you say, oh, is the Spirit moving? Is this what's, that because it doesn't always look the same in every time in every generation. I have we do a how to pray weekly thing at our house for 20 somethings, 20 somethings that don't know how to pray and want to learn how to pray. They come to our house and my wife and I just teach how to pray. Sort of, it's not really a class. It's like we spend some time learning in the Psalms and learning how to pray. We've been using Lindsay Tollefson's book. It's really good.
We got it. That's on the calendar this year. How to pray.
Oh, pray. So
we should totally do that one.
But one of the young ladies that comes, she does substitute teaching in the junior high public school system here. Wonderful young lady, and and she was saying apathy marks the generation that's coming. The teenagers, the apathy. So there's no other word. And my first thought was, okay, we got them right where we want them. We need some preachers. Lord, raise up some preachers. We know what to do with apathy. The church has known what to do with the apathetic generation before. This has come through, right?
What? Because maybe we don't have.
Oh man, you preach Jesus, right? That if they're passionate about something else, they're harder to get the attention of, right? And so you've got an apathetic generation. They'll sit still if you can get in front of them. They're not doing anything. They're not going anywhere, right? I think this was the hippie generation. You read. I've read a lot of stuff about the Jesus people movement and all of that. And every preacher that had any sort of success, they said was, we had an apathetic generation. Why was sex and drugs growing? They were apathetic. They said, there is no use for my life. I may as well just do drugs, have sex. What what made the difference was preachers that went to them, preachers that got up off their duff and went to them, and it converted in droves. Now, unfortunately, at the time, there weren't good churches for them to go to. And that was the problem, right? But they are the ones that all of the different reformed revival, the revival of reformed churches, all grew in America, grew out of the Jesus people movement, right?
Look at Doug
now
Wilson,
we're ready for them, right? Yeah, exactly. Here in our town, we've got a bunch of great Reformed Baptist churches, that Reformed Baptist and Reformed Charismatic churches that all grew out of that Jesus people movement. There's a bunch of them all over town, ready for a generation of converted ex-apathetics, that wasn't here when the hippie generation all got converted. So I think I look around and say, we just gotta get preachers that'll go get them, and this is what white fields look like. It's just we're ready for the harvest.
Just
I
gotta
mean,
go and
you just got to go get them, and I think that's always the difficulty, and some of it has to do with the rivalry that the church, and this is the same thing that happened in the 60s, the rivalry that the church began developing with, developed a rivalry with the world, and said it's us versus them, and started shutting down and locking doors. But it's hard to not be encouraged, reading First Great Awakening stories, Jesus people stories, Welsh revival stories, that it, and as many problems as some of those movements caused, uh, the movements themselves didn't cause the problem. It's the movement of the spirit happening in eras with such significant cosmological problems, that cause the problems. But I think we're in a Fields or White sort of situation.
But I don't disagree with you, but with more of a broken cosmology than we've ever had before. So that means, if that's the case, the spirit moving again, which is, I believe, is going to happen and is happening, you're going to have to now, if we're learning anything, make sure that we're drilling down on rightly ordered loves, because
exactly.
we have to drill down on that, and on the cosmology that we actually are working and operating in, so that we are ahead of the type of fallout that comes when people who love God and who want to do something for God don't understand the kind of world that they're in. And that's
Right.
very easy. That's easy to do. And you get a mess, and you have to clean up the mess. You come up with all kinds of doctrines and things, and go back to the beginnings again. And
Yeah.
we know the process. It's not like we don't know what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. We know how it happens. But we're not ready in a lot of ways for that type of structure, because we're not. You talked about this before. You talked about it. There's a lot of people who want discipleship. And I understand that they want somebody to disciple them, but there is no one to disciple you. That doesn't exist. So you're going to have to buckle down, do the hard work yourself, and then find somebody underneath you that you need to disciple.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah,
you said that,
exactly.
and I was like, man, you're dead right about that. Because what we'll spend our time doing is, man, I wish I had somebody to disciple me. And we'll spend 20 years wishing that, instead of actually saying, okay, let me go pour myself into, 16 families, or one family, or one guy.
Yeah.
We don't think about it like that at all, but we need to. I got to ask you before we go one thing. Have you thought much about what there's two ways I want to ask you this. Have you thought much about what you want to teach Knox this year, or or much about where you kind of want, you hope that the impact of what we do here does, and what kind of direction you want to take our conversations? Have you thought about that at all for 2023? Or do you even think of New Year's resolutions? What is it?
I mean, Aaron and I made some New Year's resolutions together for, what new habits do we want our family to have, and some things like that. But I mean, I think what I love seeing when people are inspired to create, when it moves beyond, um, taking in information, and becomes like poetry and art, and that, storytelling, and all of that. Um, but I mean, I think, literacy is
Yeah.
the thing, right? Is when you
Yeah.
move from grammar, from understanding the grammar of a thing to, understanding the layers of communication. That's what I think. That's where I think the power is. Um, I mean, it's coming to this. It's like, you come to the supper. The supper. Um, when you come to the supper by faith, God meets us there, and but the longer I have communed with the Lord week in and week out, and come to the table, and the more the table means, or the more meaning the table has. Not because God keeps adding to it in my experience. But it's the same with poetry and art. And I mean, I just came back to Macbeth recently, and it had been a couple of years. I think the last time I saw Macbeth was when the Apple TV one came out, and there's and it's like, how can this get better each time? And that's what I want is to get people into that mode. How do all of these things keep getting better each time? Come back to them over and over. The supper gets better each time. The scriptures get better each time you read through them. The Shakespeare gets better each time you come to them. And I think Shakespeare is a good example. Just went through Henry V and thought, and had never noticed that one of the central themes is that the church, that every church member is concerned about politics, and Henry starts concerned about politics but ends concerned about God, right? That and that the church has bought into that all things are political, the way Henry has at the beginning, but by the end Henry has come back around. And I'd not noticed that the churches, the ecclesiastical jibe that Shakespeare makes in the middle of the play. So, and that's what I want. I want people to see the Western civilization's heritage that they have and enjoy it. Did that make sense?
No, it does. That's where I'm at. I feel like that those things last year's kind of set that up for me. I went and got the 5-foot bookshelf, from Harvard's 5-foot bookshelf in the classics, and I'm reading through it, and I'm starting to see God's hand sovereignly working through time from the beginning, of literature all the way out to where we currently are. And I'm seeing these things as a blessing and not a curse. I'm seeing things as someone has experienced the blessings of God in time, and they left a roadmap to say, look, man, you don't have to start from scratch. You can start further ahead than where we are. We've talked about that last year, was being shipwrecked. And it's like, man, there's a full blessing that is inside of being literate. And I'm not just meaning understanding what words mean, but understanding how God is using literature, history to help build, develop, and expand what he's doing in the world for the crown rights of King Jesus. And to see them, and then to see my own family and myself, and then to do the things that God has said. God says, do this, and I want to obey, right? That's faith. That's what I want to operate that way. And so part of the thing that I'm seeing in that, as we're talking about restoring loves, I want to pound as much as I can with this show and this year on loving. I talked about it on Whitlock. I talked about it on Cross Politic, the Ninja Turtle moment where Michelangelo comes out and says, I love being a turtle.
Yeah.
I want there to be a massive love because of God for who we are, and love that. Love being a man, love being a woman, love being that child. I said on the show, I want my children to look at me and say, Dad, I love being your son. That's what I want to, and I want to do that by showing the beauty of hierarchy so that I have a natural distaste for egalitarianism. I realize that I have a distaste for it because of the ugliness that it pops up, but then I don't love the thing that is naturally better and beautiful and bigger, right? I don't have the same sort of loves for it where I'm like, because I think because of that, because we don't have those loves for hierarchy, what they do with those egalitarianism does is pulls us off the wall of building. So when you say you want people to build and to make, it's because they love hierarchy. It was like, ooh, guess what men do? Guess what men do for women? Guess what women do? Guess what women do for men? Guess what servants do? All of these different structures. I want there to be a type of government and leadership that starts to separate itself from the federal government, so that we have a self-correcting system in our covenants apart from a federalized or a civil magistrate form of governing, right? They don't get to govern everything. They don't get to manage everything. But if you don't have those hierarchical loves in place, then by default, you have to put power all in one place so that they get to control what you do in your privacy. And so I think if we create those higher order loves, we will create an antidote to the current egalitarian structure and government system that we have right now. And that's what I want to build. And I don't think it takes a lot of people. I think it
doesn't. Well, because the hatred of egalitarianism doesn't produce Middle Earth. It's the love of hierarchy that produces Middle Earth. So
that's right.
And I'm reading the Mabinogion, which is the Welsh, the Welsh legends, the legends of Wales collected. Yeah, it's an ancient collection, and over these men, it's kind of one of the roots of chivalry, but these men that have taken vows to protect all women, right? That's what Christianity brought to the UK. It's central to it was this vow that men, as they grew in their faith, they began vowing to protect women. And it's so beautiful. It's so moving over and over. And you end up building a civilization because you've got women to protect, right? You love it's this love. I mean, it's so ridiculous. It makes feminism look so ridiculous, right? It's not because you think when they're like, oh yeah, women used to be so mistreated. You think,
right?
Women used to be protected. They used to be considered the ones that were worthy. And now they talk about the knights that take advantage of women and how that's a real thing and how horrible it was and how evil you have to be if you they meet this knight that has women locked up right in his castle, and they literally won't even engage with him in words because they're like, he should die. Period. He's kidnapped women. He should die. We don't discuss this. We don't have conversation. But they pull their lances out and they charge because they found a man that kidnaps women. That's not how you treat women.
We will not tolerate this.
We will not tolerate. You think that it's such a, but it's the love of that kind of where power of the strong is to protect the weak, and that love of hierarchy, it produced Middle Earth. The hatred of egalitarianism hasn't produced anything.
All right, so next week, man, we'll go through our book list. 24 books.
Yeah, 24 books. Let's do it.
All right, bro. Appreciate you, man.